I stared at the termination notice on my desk. Dana Mellis, strategic planning lead, effective immediately. The paper felt heavier than it should have. My phone buzzed. Lawrence Kim, my supervisor. Can you swing by my office? I walked down the hall at Brave-Born Technologies headquarters, past the glass conference rooms where I'd spent 4 years building contingency frameworks. Lawrence sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, wearing that expression he reserved for difficult conversations. Dana, I want to be transparent with you. The executive team feels your approach doesn't align with our current velocity. You're too focused on risk mitigation when we need aggressive forward momentum. I kept my voice level. The Q3 projections I flagged last month were overly conservative. We exceeded them by 18%. He leaned back. Look, you're talented, but talent isn't enough. We need people who trust the vision. The meeting lasted 6 minutes. Security escorted me out 20 minutes later, my desk contents in a cardboard box. I passed the strategy pod where my team sat. Former team. Olivia Wu glanced up, her face carefully neutral. Outside, the afternoon sun felt wrong. Too bright for a firing. At home, I set the box on my kitchen table and stared at it. My cat, Pepper, rubbed against my ankles. I picked her up, feeling her warmth, her complete indifference to corporate hierarchies. My phone buzzed again. Lawrence. I almost didn't answer. Dana, thank God. We have a situation. The vendor contracts she managed, something's wrong with the payment schedules. Treasury is seeing massive discrepancies. I need you to walk me through your filing system. I held the phone away from my face for 3 seconds. I was fired 4 hours ago. I know, but this is urgent. The audit starts Monday and we can't locate half the documentation. You're the only one who knows where everything is. Olivia has access to all my shared drives. She says the folder structure doesn't make sense. Please, Dana. I'm asking as a colleague. I hung up. Sleep didn't come that night. I kept thinking about the audit. Not because I cared about Lawrence, but because I'd built those systems. If something was genuinely wrong, it meant my work had failed. That thought ate at me more than the termination. At 2 a.m, I opened my laptop. My credentials still worked, IT probably hadn't processed the termination yet. I pulled up the vendor management database. The first thing I noticed was the access log. Entries from accounts I didn't recognize. Administrative permissions granted 3 weeks ago to someone named C. Brenner. I'd never heard that name. I checked the payment schedules Lawrence mentioned. The numbers looked right on the surface, but the approval timestamps were wrong. Payments I'd scheduled for quarterly review were marked as approved weekly. The approver? C. Brenner. I pulled transaction histories. Small amounts at first. $500 here, $1,000 there, buried in legitimate invoices. Then larger. 10,000. 20. Always to vendors I recognized, but the quantities didn't match our actual orders. By 4 a.m, I had a pattern. Over 6 months, roughly $400,000 had been redirected through inflated invoices and phantom service contracts. The scheme was elegant, small enough per transaction to avoid automatic flags, distributed across enough vendors to seem like normal business variants. I documented everything. Screenshots, transaction IDs, timestamp inconsistencies. Then I looked up C. Brenner in the employee directory. Cassidy Brenner. Director of Vendor Relations. Hired 7 months ago. Reported directly to Lawrence. My hand stopped moving on the keyboard. I called my former colleague, Helen Park, at 7 a.m. She'd moved to internal audit 2 years ago. We'd stayed friendly. Dana? I heard about yesterday. I'm so sorry. Helen, I need to ask you something off the record. Are you aware of any irregularities in vendor payments? A pause. Why are you asking? Because I found some. A lot. And I think they're still happening. We met at a coffee shop near her apartment. I brought printouts. Helen went through them methodically, her expression growing tighter with each page. This is systematic fraud, she said finally. How did you find this? Lawrence called me last night asking about vendor files. Said there were discrepancies. I looked. Did you tell him what you found? No. Because Cassidy Brenner reports to him. Either he knows and he's involved, or he's incompetent. Neither option makes me want to hand him evidence. Helen tapped the papers. I can't take this to audit formally. You're no longer an employee, and this data was accessed after your termination. Any lawyer would shred it on procedural grounds. What if the data came from an ongoing employee who had legitimate access? She met my eyes. I'd need cause to investigate. A formal complaint or a clear operational problem. The audit starts Monday. That's cause. Helen left with copies of everything. I went home and waited. Monday morning, my phone rang. Unknown number. Ms. Mellis? This is Gordon Vance from Whitfield Legal. Helen Park referred your situation to us. We'd like to discuss representation. Gordon's office occupied the 42nd floor of a downtown tower. He was mid-50s, gray at the temples, with the calm precision of someone who'd spent decades in corporate litigation. Helen showed me your documentation. It's compelling, but we have a problem. The data was obtained after your employment ended. That makes it vulnerable to suppression. What if we could replicate it through legitimate channels? Then we'd have a case. But that requires cooperation from someone with current access and standing. He folded his hands. Helen mentioned you were terminated without cause. Tell me about that. I walked him through the meeting with Lawrence. The stated reasons. The timing, just before the audit. Were you given any documentation of performance issues prior to termination? No. My last review was 4 months ago. Exceeds expectations across all metrics. Gordon made notes. They terminated you 4 hours before calling about vendor documentation problems. That's either spectacularly poor timing or spectacularly calculated timing. What do you mean? If you were about to uncover financial irregularities through normal work processes, firing you removes the person most likely to notice. But if they fire you and then immediately need your help with those exact files, it suggests they didn't think through the consequences. He leaned forward. Here's what I propose. We file a wrongful termination suit. Discovery will give us legal access to the same files you accessed informally. If the fraud pattern holds under formal scrutiny, we expand the case to include whistleblower protections and possibly criminal referrals. How long will that take? Months. But it's airtight. I thought about $400,000 disappearing while we filed motions. What if there's a faster way? Gordon raised an eyebrow. I called Olivia that afternoon. We met at a park near the office. I shouldn't be talking to you, she said, but she sat down anyway. I know. But I need to ask you something. When Lawrence asked you to find vendor documentation, what exactly couldn't you locate? Everything was there. The folder structure made perfect sense. I told him that. So why did he say you couldn't find it? Olivia looked at her hands. I don't know. But after you left, Cassidy came by. She asked me to pull some vendor files for reconciliation. Specific ones. I pulled them, and she took paper copies, not digital. Do you remember which vendors? About 20. All the ones you flagged in your Q2 risk assessment for having unusual billing patterns. I felt something settle in my chest. Olivia, those files document fraud. Systematic inflation and phantom contracts. I found it Saturday night. Her face went pale. If I'd given her those files, she would have destroyed the evidence. You didn't know. What do I do? Nothing yet. But I'm working with a lawyer. If we need someone with current access to pull legitimate reports, would you help? She nodded slowly. Gordon filed the wrongful termination suit on Wednesday. Braidborn's legal team responded within hours, offering a settlement. 12-month severance, non-disclosure agreement, mutual non-disparagement. They want this quiet, Gordon said. That tells me they're worried about discovery. Reject it. You're certain? Litigation is expensive and uncertain. This is guaranteed money. I'm certain. Discovery began. Gordon subpoenaed 6 months of vendor payment records, approval logs, and internal communications. Braidborn fought it, arguing irrelevance to the termination claim. The judge disagreed. The documents arrived 3 weeks later. Boxes of them. I spent 5 days in Gordon's conference room, cross-referencing transactions against my original findings. The pattern held. More than held, it expanded. The fraud stretched back 9 months, totaling over $700,000. But there was something new. Email chains between Lawrence and Cassidy discussing budget optimization strategies and vendor relationship management initiatives. Nothing explicitly criminal, but the timing aligned perfectly with fraudulent transactions. Gordon brought in a forensic accountant, Margaret E. She spent a week analyzing the data. "This is textbook embezzlement," she said, laying out a presentation. "Inflated invoices, phantom services, kickback structures. Whoever designed this understood accounting controls well enough to exploit the gaps. And these emails suggest coordination at the supervisory level." "Can you prove Lawrence knew it was fraud?" I asked. "Not from the emails alone. They're carefully worded. But the approval timestamps show he signed off on transactions that should have triggered automatic escalation to finance. He either bypassed controls deliberately or disabled them. Either way, he's liable." Gordon drafted an amended complaint adding fraud claims and naming both Lawrence and Cassidy as defendants. We filed it along with Margaret's analysis. The reaction was immediate. Bourne's board called an emergency session. I heard about it from Olivia, who texted me, "They've suspended Lawrence and Cassidy pending investigation. People are freaking out." 2 days later, the company issued an internal memo announcing a comprehensive financial audit by an external firm. The memo mentioned my termination, describing it as potentially retaliatory and stating that the company was cooperating fully with ongoing legal proceedings. Lawrence called me 3 times that week. I didn't answer. The external audit took 6 weeks. The auditors found everything we'd found, plus more. Cassidy had used the stolen funds to pay personal credit card bills, mortgage payments, and a boat purchase. She'd been sloppy with the digital trail, confident that the transaction volume would bury the evidence. Lawrence's culpability was murkier. He'd approved suspicious transactions, but his defense was that he trusted his direct reports and didn't scrutinize routine vendor payments. Plausible, except for the timing of my termination. The auditors interviewed 17 current and former employees. A pattern emerged. I'd raised concerns about vendor billing irregularities in 3 separate reports over 8 months. Each time, Lawrence had dismissed them as statistical noise. 2 weeks after my 3rd report, Cassidy was given expanded vendor approval authority. 1 week after that authority was granted, I was terminated. The board released its findings in a terse public statement. Lawrence and Cassidy were terminated for cause. The company had filed a criminal referral with the district attorney's office. Restitution proceedings were underway. I watched the news coverage from my couch, pepper curled in my lap. The local business reporter called it a significant governance failure at a once promising tech firm. The stock dropped 14% in 2 days. Gordon called. "The DA wants to meet with you. They're considering fraud and embezzlement charges against both of them." The prosecutor's office occupied a blocky concrete building downtown. Assistant District Attorney Veronica Shaw met us in a windowless conference room. "Ms. Mellis, your documentation was instrumental in uncovering this scheme. I want to walk through the timeline with you." We spent 3 hours reconstructing events. When I flagged irregularities. When I was terminated. When I discovered the full scope. Veronica took detailed notes. "Here's what we have. Cassidy Brenner created false vendor accounts and processed fraudulent payments totaling $730,000 over 9 months. She used her position to bypass approval controls. Lawrence Kim approved transactions he should have escalated and terminated the employee most likely to expose the fraud. We can prove embezzlement against Cassidy. The question is whether we can prove Lawrence was a knowing participant or merely negligent. What's the difference legally?" I asked. "Conspiracy to commit fraud versus failure to supervise. One's a felony, one's a civil matter." Gordon leaned forward. "The timing of Dana's termination seems awfully convenient." "It does. But convenient isn't the same as provable. Unless we can show Lawrence knew about the fraud and fired Dana specifically to hide it, he'll argue he terminated her for legitimate performance reasons and the timing was coincidental." I thought about Lawrence's call the night I was fired. His desperation about the vendor files. What if I recorded our phone conversations? Veronica's eyebrows rose. "Did you?" No. But he called me hours after my termination begging for help with vendor documentation. He claimed there were discrepancies and he couldn't find files. That was the first time anyone mentioned problems with vendor records. If he didn't know there were issues, why was he looking? That's circumstantial, but it's useful. Combined with the termination timing and the approval patterns, it builds a narrative. Let me talk to my boss. The DA's office filed charges 3 weeks later. Cassidy faced 11 counts of embezzlement and fraud. Lawrence faced conspiracy to commit fraud and obstruction of justice. The arraignment was brief. Both pleaded not guilty. Cassidy's lawyer immediately started negotiating a plea. Lawrence's lawyer filed motions to dismiss, arguing insufficient evidence. I went back to Gordon's office. What happens to my case now? We keep pushing. The criminal proceedings actually strengthen your wrongful termination claim. If they're convicted, it proves your termination was retaliatory. Even if they're not, the board's findings and the settlement discussions show the company knows it acted improperly. Settlement discussions? Braeborn's counsel reached out yesterday. They want to talk numbers. We met in a neutral conference room the following week. Braeborn brought 3 lawyers and their head of HR, Fiona Marsh. I'd worked with Fiona on policy reviews. She didn't meet my eyes when I entered. Their lead counsel, an older man named Stewart, opened. We're prepared to offer 18 months severance, full benefits continuation, and a neutral reference. In exchange for a comprehensive release of all claims and confidentiality regarding the settlement terms. Gordon didn't blink. My client wants her job back. Stewart's expression flickered. That's not on the table. Then we're wasting time. Dana was wrongfully terminated to cover up fraud. She was proven right about everything she flagged. You destroyed her career to protect a thief and his incompetent supervisor. 18 months of salary doesn't fix that. Fiona spoke up. The position has been filled. Then create a new one. She's a strategic planning lead. I'm sure you have strategic planning needs. Stewart shook his head. The board won't approve rehiring under these circumstances. The optics, I said quietly, are that you fired the person who tried to stop the theft. Rehiring me sends the message that you value integrity. Not rehiring me sends the message that exposing fraud gets you blacklisted. The room went silent. Stewart glanced at Fiona. We'll need to consult with the board. The board meeting happened 2 weeks later. I wasn't invited, but Gordon gave me updates. The board was split. Half wanted to settle with cash and close the chapter. Half worried that refusing to rehire me would trigger more negative press and regulatory scrutiny. The deciding vote came from the board chair, an investor named Waltering whom I'd never met. He apparently asked one question: did she follow proper channels before going to a lawyer? The answer was yes. I'd flagged concerns internally 3 times. I'd only sought legal counsel after being terminated and discovering evidence of active fraud. Walter voted for reinstatement. The offer came through Gordon 3 days later. Strategic Planning Director, reporting directly to the CFO instead of through Lawrence's old chain. 20% salary increase. Full back pay from the termination date. Public acknowledgement of my contributions to uncovering the fraud. They're also offering a board observer seat, Gordon added. Non-voting, but you'd attend meetings and have access to financials. Why would they offer that? Because Waltering insisted. He thinks the board needs someone who actually reads the reports and asks hard questions. I took the offer. My first day back was strange. People congratulated me in hushed tones. Some apologized for not speaking up during my termination. Others avoided me entirely, unsure how to act around someone who'd successfully sued the company. Olivia met me at my new office. Corner space, windows overlooking the city. I'm glad you're back, she said. Thanks for helping. The files you pulled for the audit made the difference. I should have said something when they fired you. You didn't know what was happening. None of us did. She hesitated at the door. For what it's worth, I'm transferring to your team. If you'll have me. I smiled. I'll have you. The weeks that followed were intense. I sat in on executive meetings where my presence was clearly uncomfortable. Some leaders welcomed my input. Others treated me like a ticking bomb, careful with every word. I didn't particularly care about their comfort. I focused on the work. The finance team had instituted emergency controls after the fraud discovery, but they were reactive patches rather than systematic fixes. I drafted a comprehensive proposal for approval workflow redesign. Every payment over $5,000 would require dual authorization with documented business justification. Vendor onboarding would include background verification and reference checks. Quarterly reconciliation reports would go directly to the board, not through departmental filters. The CFO, a pragmatic woman named Yolanda Green, reviewed my proposal over coffee in her office. "This is thorough," she said. "It's also going to slow down every transaction by at least 48 hours. Good. Fraud thrives on speed and opacity. We were moving too fast to notice we were bleeding money. Some people will fight this. They'll say it hampers agility. Those people can explain to the board why agility matters more than accountability." Yolanda smiled faintly. "I like having you here, Dana. You don't apologize for being right." The proposal went to the board the following month. Waltering read it aloud, paragraph by paragraph, asking clarifying questions. 2 board members pushed back on the dual authorization requirement, calling it bureaucratic overreach. I addressed them directly. "We lost $730,000 because one person had unilateral approval authority. The bureaucracy you're worried about costs us 48 hours per transaction. The fraud cost us 9 months of theft and a year of legal proceedings. I'll take the 48 hours." The proposal passed unanimously. Implementing it was another matter. I worked with the IT team to build the workflow into our financial systems. We ran pilot tests, identified bottlenecks, adjusted thresholds. The process took 3 months. During that time, the criminal trial moved forward. Cassidy's plea deal was finalized. She would serve 5 years with eligibility for parole after 3. Full restitution. Permanent prohibition from financial management roles. Her sentencing hearing was brief. The judge asked if she had anything to say. Cassidy stood, her lawyer beside her, and read from a prepared statement. "I take full responsibility for my actions. I betrayed the trust of my colleagues and caused significant harm to Brave-born Technologies. I am deeply sorry." The words were correct. The delivery was flat. I sat in the back row, watching her face. She looked tired. Defeated. But not particularly remorseful. The judge thanked her and imposed the sentence. Cassidy was led out by a marshal. She didn't look back at the gallery. Lawrence's trial was scheduled for 6 weeks later. His defense strategy became clear during pretrial motions. He would argue that Cassidy had deceived him, that he'd relied on her expertise in vendor management, that any approval failures were negligence rather than conspiracy. Veronica called me to discuss testimony preparation. "His lawyer is going to paint you as someone with a grudge. They'll argue you were fired for legitimate performance reasons and you're now trying to reframe it as retaliation. I have documentation proving the performance claims were false." "I know. But juries don't always care about documentation. They care about narratives. His narrative is that he made an honest mistake trusting the wrong person. Your narrative needs to be that he systematically ignored warnings and then eliminated the person who could expose him." We rehearsed for hours. Veronica played the role of Lawrence's lawyer, asking hostile questions designed to rattle me. Gordon sat in, offering feedback on tone and pacing. "You're too controlled," he said at one point. "The jury needs to see that this hurt you. Not devastated you, but hurt you. Show them the human cost." I tried again. This time, when Veronica asked why I'd accessed company files after termination, I let my voice tighten slightly. "Because I built those systems. And when someone tells me they're broken, I check. That's what competent analysts do." Gordon nodded. "Better." The trial lasted 2 weeks. I testified on day 4. Lawrence's lawyer did exactly what Veronica predicted, suggesting I was bitter about being fired and had manufactured evidence to support a wrongful termination claim. I stayed calm. I walked through the timeline methodically. The warnings I'd issued. The dismissals I'd received. The termination. The late-night call. The pattern I'd found. "And you accessed these files without authorization?" the lawyer asked. My credentials were still active. The company hadn't revoked my access. But you knew you'd been terminated. Yes. And I also knew that if there was genuinely a problem with vendor payments, people needed to know immediately. I chose disclosure over protocol. That's convenient. It's what happened. The lawyer moved on. Veronica's redirect was simple. She asked me to describe the 3 reports I'd filed before termination. I outlined each one, including the dates, the specific concerns raised, and Lawrence's responses. And after each of these reports, what action did Lawrence take? None. He told me I was overthinking routine variance. Did you believe that assessment? No. The variance patterns were statistically anomalous. But he was my supervisor. I documented my concerns and continued monitoring. And then you were terminated. Yes. Thank you, Ms. Mellis. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. They found Lawrence guilty on 2 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud. Not guilty on obstruction of justice, apparently accepting that firing me might have been negligence rather than intentional witness suppression. The sentencing hearing happened 3 weeks after that. I attended, sitting in the same back row I'd occupied for Cassidy's hearing. The judge, a different one this time, reviewed the evidence methodically. She noted Lawrence's approval of suspicious transactions. His dismissal of multiple warnings. His failure to escalate concerns to the board or finance. Mr. Kim, you held a position of trust and authority. You were responsible for ensuring proper governance and oversight. Instead, you prioritized expediency over accountability. Your actions enabled substantial financial harm to your organization and its stakeholders. She sentenced him to 3 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 18 months. Full restitution. Permanent bar from supervisory roles and financial management. Mandatory community service focused on ethics education. Lawrence accepted the sentence without visible reaction. When the hearing ended, he stood and was escorted out. This time, he did glance back. His eyes swept the gallery and landed on me for perhaps 2 seconds. I held his gaze. Then he was gone. Outside, reporters clustered on the courthouse steps. Veronica gave a brief statement about accountability and systemic reform. I slipped out a side exit, walking 3 blocks to where I'd parked. In my car, I sat for several minutes before starting the engine. The city moved around me. People heading to lunch, running errands, completely unaware that something had just concluded. That night, I made dinner at home. Pepper wound between my ankles, demanding attention. I fed her first, then cooked salmon with roasted vegetables. Simple food. Grounding. My phone buzzed throughout the evening. Messages from colleagues, from Helen, from Gordon. I responded to each one briefly, then set the phone aside. I thought about the 2 years that had passed since my termination. The sleepless nights investigating. The months of litigation. The scrutiny and testimony. All of it to arrive here, at this quiet Saturday evening with a fed cat and a decent meal. Worth it. Unquestionably worth it. But also exhausting in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged until now. The following Monday, I returned to work. Waltering was waiting in my office when I arrived. Dana. I wanted to thank you personally. What you did, uncovering the fraud, pursuing it despite personal and professional cost, that took real integrity. I just wanted the truth documented. Most people don't. Most people want comfort and plausible deniability. You wanted accountability. He paused. The board has been discussing succession planning. We'd like you to consider the chief strategy officer role when Yolanda retires next year. I blinked. Yolanda's retiring? She hasn't announced it yet, but yes. She's been here 11 years. She's ready for something different. And she specifically recommended you as her successor. I'll think about it. Please do. We need leaders who understand that strong foundations matter more than fast growth. After he left, I sat at my desk, looking out at the city. Chief Strategy Officer. The same executive tier Lawrence had occupied. The symmetry was not lost on me. But it wasn't about symmetry. It was about building systems that would outlast any individual ego or ambition. I opened my laptop and started drafting a memo on long-term strategic planning frameworks. The work continued. 6 months later, Braidborn announced my promotion. The press release emphasized my role in uncovering fraud and implementing new governance standards. Some industry observers called it a redemption arc. I found that framing irritating. There was nothing to redeem. I'd been right from the beginning. My first major initiative as CSO was acquiring Apex Solutions, a struggling competitor with solid technology but poor market execution. The deal made strategic sense, but it also gave me the chance to bring in new leadership and establish cultural norms from the ground up. I made Olivia the integration lead. She'd proven herself repeatedly over the past 2 years, navigating complex projects with precision and integrity. The acquisition went smoothly. 60 new employees joined Braveborn, and we retained 54 of them after the first year. One of those new hires was someone I'd worked with early in my career, a product manager named Corinne Ashby. She'd been let go from her previous role for pushing back on a decision she believed was unethical. We had coffee during her first week. "I heard about what happened with Lawrence and Cassidy," she said. "That took guts. It took documentation and a good lawyer. Still, most people would have taken the settlement and moved on. Most people weren't fired for being right." She smiled. "Fair point." Corinne became one of my most trusted advisors. She had a talent for identifying misalignments between stated values and actual practices. We instituted a quarterly ethics review where anyone could flag concerns directly to the board. Anonymous if preferred, but with optional attribution for those willing to attach their names. The system worked. We caught 2 cases of data mishandling and 1 instance of vendor favoritism before they became serious problems. Each time, we addressed the issue transparently, documenting the findings and the corrective actions. People started to trust that raising concerns wouldn't end their careers. It was a small cultural shift, but a real one. A year into my CSO role, I was invited to speak at a governance conference. The topic was building accountability structures in high-growth environments. I almost declined. Public speaking had never been my strength, but Yolanda encouraged me to accept. "You have a story people need to hear," she said. "Not the dramatic parts. The boring parts. How you built systems that actually worked." I spoke for 30 minutes about approval workflows, documentation standards, and creating channels for dissent. The audience was mostly compliance officers and audit professionals. They asked detailed questions about implementation challenges and stakeholder resistance. One person asked how I'd convinced leadership to adopt controls that slowed down operations. "I didn't convince them," I said. "The fraud convinced them." My job was to make sure we learned from it instead of just papering over it with shallow fixes. Afterward, several attendees approached me with follow-up questions. One was a young analyst who'd recently been fired for flagging expense irregularities at her company. "How did you keep going?" she asked. "After they terminated you. How did you not just give up?" I thought about that night 2 years ago, sitting at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning, deciding whether to look at the files. I kept going because the alternative was letting them be right. They said I was too cautious, too focused on risk. If I'd walked away, that would have been true. But I knew I was right about the numbers. So I proved it. What if you'd been wrong? Then I would have been wrong with documentation. That's still better than being silent. She nodded slowly, then thanked me and left. I flew home that evening. Pepper greeted me at the door with her usual demanding meow. I fed her, then collapsed on the couch. My phone showed 3 missed calls from an unknown number. No voicemail. I ignored it. The next morning, the same number called again. This time I answered. "Ms. Mellis? This is Sterling Canyon Correctional Facility. You have a message from inmate Lawrence Kim requesting a visitor approval. Do you accept?" I stared at the ceiling. "No." "Understood. I'll note the declination." They hung up. Lawrence called twice more over the following months, each time through the prison system. Each time I declined. There was nothing to discuss. The facts had been established. The consequences had been imposed. Conversation would only create ambiguity where clarity already existed. 18 months into his sentence, Lawrence became eligible for parole. I received notification from the prosecutor's office that I could submit a victim impact statement if I chose. I did not choose. The parole board released him after 20 months. I learned about it from a brief news item in the business section. Former tech executive granted early release, required to complete community service, barred from financial oversight roles. I felt nothing in particular. 3 weeks after his release, I took Pepper to the vet for her annual checkup. The waiting room was crowded. I sat in the corner, scrolling through emails. Dana? Lawrence stood by the door, holding a cat carrier. He looked older. Grayer. The confidence that used to define him had been reduced to something cautious and muted. Lawrence. I didn't know you came here. 3 years now. He shifted his weight. How's Pepper? Good. Healthy. You? Getting by. I'm doing bookkeeping for a nonprofit. Community reintegration program, part of my service requirement. I nodded. The vet tech called his name. He picked up the carrier, then paused. I wanted to say, what happened shouldn't have happened. Any of it. I studied him. No excuses. No justifications. Just a flat acknowledgement. No, I agreed. It shouldn't have. He left.